Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the hearing. We're going to hear some more evidence today. Yes, Mr. Millett?
Mr. Chairman, can we please have Mr. Dowden back to the witness table?
Thank you. Now, Mr. Dowden, I know this is quite a difficult exercise, and I think in view of that, and for the benefit of all of us, we're going to have a few more breaks, perhaps slightly shorter, but roughly once an hour, Mr. Millett. Would that be convenient?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. What I was going to suggest was that we break once an hour for 5 minutes, if that's acceptable to you. Once an hour for 5 minutes with a slightly longer break mid-morning for, say, 15 minutes.
Yes, very well. Well, you choose a convenient point in the question.
Very well. It'll be convenient to me and convenient to Mr. Dowden, I hope.
Yes, thank you. All right.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Dowden, before I start, may I say how grateful we are as the inquiry team to you for coming along yesterday and spending the entire day answering questions from me. I want you to know that you are doing a public service, and we are extremely thankful to you for it. Can I start by asking you to go back to policy 633, which is the high-rise firefighting policy, which is at tab 4 of the policy bundle. And if you would turn in that bundle and tab, please, to Appendix 1, which is at page 19 internally. And we looked at that a little bit yesterday in relation to the shopping list of matters to be addressed on Section 72D visits to premises. And just looking at the list as a whole, my first question is, would you expect to address all of these issues in a single 72D visit?
I wouldn't say that in a single 72D visit, because the 72D process is a process that, okay, the system was set up, the information was already out there in different systems, usually on a paper system that was filed away at stations, and we had the RD system that was born, and a lot of the information from that was populated already from existing systems we had within the London Fire Brigade. So the assumption and the expectation is a lot of that information would all be readily available within the ORD process. So if it was a premise that was of a new build, or that came to light that we had no record of that premise, then yes, the expectation would that we'd have to do a very robust and thorough 72D visit. However, when conducting premises that are already existing to us and known to us, then there may well be amendments, and we can refer back to the Appendix 1 and also Policy Note 800 to make those amendments. So there isn't the expectation that every single 72D visit we do, you have to follow a real robust and process following that, because the expectation is there should be some existing information there, but that may well need amending.
Right. And when a building underwent a substantial refurbishment, what would your approach be to this shopping list, if I can call it that, when you went to visit that building, when it was at the end of the refurbishment?
It'd be sort of looking at points if there was any amendments to that premise. So any additional fire safety measures, additions in terms of our resourcing. From my sort of recollection memory, that would be where we would be looking at to amend the 72D process.
So just so I'm clear, you would look at the details of the refurbishment and then check and see whether those details were things you had to check off on the list.
But obviously only
Is that right?
to the information that was surrendered to us. So if there's something within that building we weren't aware of, or we didn't necessarily understand because that information hasn't been surrendered to us, or we weren't known, the risk wasn't identified to us, then that's something that I, as an individual or watch officers, wouldn't necessarily understand or record.
And who would you rely on to provide you with the information that you say would be surrendered to
That
you?
would be the responsible person for whoever owns or is responsible for that block. So if it's a housing association, a local authority, or a private landlord.
And in respect of your visits to Grenfell Tower, do you remember who the responsible person was?
The only people, the organisations I know in terms of relation to responsible persons for Grenfell Tower would be, from my understanding, Rydens, who were the building contractor, and KCTMO, which is Kensington Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, who I understand are the managing agents of Grenfell Tower.
And how would it work? Would you rely on them to volunteer relevant information about the matters on the shopping list, or would you interrogate them, ask them questions about matters on the shopping list?
It'd probably be a two-way traffic, but I would be hopeful that if there was a certain risk within that building that wasn't expected, then that should be surrendered from that responsible party or person. The only way I would sort of refer, and let's put high-rise aside, if I was going to another premise that had particular processes, then that were apparent, then that's understandable. We can put that into our hazards and risks. If there was storage of certain products, certain signage, then obviously that's something we look for. But also they should have a responsible person who is undertakes that responsibility to let us and inform crews of that risk.
Yes. Now, you can see from the list that one of the items on the list, it's 6 bullet points up from the bottom, evacuation arrangements which may include phased evacuation. Do you see that on the screen? You've already said, I think, that you didn't know what the evacuation plan was for Grenfell Tower for the purposes of your 72D visit. My question is, were you aware at the time of that visit that it was a high-rise building with a stay-put strategy in place?
I wouldn't say at that time of the visit I was aware, but my assumption is, and from previous knowledge, that majority of high-rise residential blocks will employ a stay-put policy.
Right. Thank you. Now, I'm going to ask you some questions about the night, and to start with your arrival at Grenfell Tower, which is, I think, where we left off yesterday afternoon, Mr. Dowden. Before we get to the detail, can I just ask you to give me a general summary of the basic points from your high-rise training based on policy 633 that you told us about how you would go about tackling a fire in a high-rise block? So,
as per policy 633, which is London Fire Brigade's high-rise policy, so we sort of look at it in stages. So it'd be en route initially, and that would be accessing any information sources that are available to us, whether that via the MDT, which we spoke about in some detail, which will give us some information about the premise, any risks that are posed. Further traffic from control, if there's make-ups, which that means any additional resources will be required. Further information in terms of multiple calls, if it's identified, if it's a person's reported incident, and that's all information that the incident commander we need to obviously put into our plan to moving forward. In terms of when we're on scene, as per policy 633, a good practice is what we need to do is confirm our water supplies. Now it'll be from a local hydrant source into our fire engine, and then we have to augment water supplies, and what that means is we have to supply water to the building if it's a dry rising main. So we supply water to that pipe within the building that allows us to firefight internally. If it's a wet rising main, then that's already fully charged with water. Expectation is at ground level we do, as an incident commander, some information gathering, so that will be from responsible people of the block, residents, and also to have a visual on the building itself. Can we see any signs and symptoms of fire? Once we've established that from information gathering, the crews, the first in attendance, will be gathering a certain amount of equipment that we need as a minimum to help us tackle a high-rise fire. This will include BA sets to be worn by firefighters, an entry control board, a forward information board, as a minimum 4 lengths of hose or more unless, and that should be identified at familiarisation visits.
Can I just pause there? 4
Yes.
lengths of hose, do you say?
So 4 lengths of 45mm hose.
Right.
And that's in each length will be 23 metres in length.
And that's to go, so that I'm clear, that's to go from the dry rising main outlet or
That's-
from the pump to the inlet?
No, that's to go from the dry rising outlet within the building.
Right.
The hose we use from the pumping appliance, so from the hydrant to the first pumping appliance, will be 70mm hose. Again, that is 23 metres in length. From pre-planning, we'll identify how much hose for that we'll need in terms of siting of appliances. And again, from the pumping appliance that's dedicated as the water machine, you'll have 70mm hose, which again is 23 metres in length, which will be supplying the dry riser inlet. Okay, and that's how we augment or supply water to that property.
And how long roughly would it take to charge the 70mm hose, which runs from the pump to the dry rising main, would you expect?
It's very difficult to put a time on that. There is a number of factors that can change that now. Obviously, we rely on hydrant supplies. It all depends if that's the hydrant supplies at that time are operable. If they're obstructed by vehicles, sometimes park over them, so we have to move that, access to them.
Right.
Personnel, resources, in terms of if we have sometimes, we can have 5 or 6 on a fire engine, sometimes we can have 4. There are a number of factors in determining how long that will take. So it should be a matter of hopefully minutes if everything works for you.
And how long would it normally take to charge the 45mm hose from the dry rising inlet to the BA crew who's about to make entry? Again,
That does have some factors in terms of timescales. It depends on where we are internally in the building, how high up we have to go, and again, if things within that building are working correctly, lift, etc. If we have to use the stairs, if the lift's compromised. So if it's on the lower floors, again, you can have a quick attack on that. But if it's on the upper floors, that can take some time. It's not a quick process in terms of tackling fires within a high-rise building. It's not we turn up, we go, we've got a water supply, we've got equipment. You have to have things in place before we can make an entry into a compartment.
Yes. And what about the bridgehead? Could you just give us an idea of what happens at the bridgehead?
The bridgehead is a place where we commit a safe place within the building that we commit our BA crews from. This will be set up 2 floors below the fire floor. This allows for a bit of contingency in case the floors above become compromised. So we always set our bridge up 2 floors below if the building allows us to do that. Because some of the high-rise buildings within London will not allow you to do that. And the one particularly North Kensington, when I can refer that to is Trellick Tower, because of the way the construction of that building is. It's a maisonette scissor style construction high rise. So you only have entrance from a protected stairwell into the flat every 3 floors. So somewhere like Trellick Tower, from local knowledge and pre-planning, our bridgehead will actually be on the 5th floor, because there is the main residential block. You have a protected walkway and then a separate protected stairwell. So it's not always 2 floors below, but you only identify that from your local knowledge and pre-planning.
Thank you. We'll come on to some details about precisely what happened in relation to the bridgehead later on. Is there anything else you want to add by way of a summary of what you know about high-rise firefighting based on Policy 633?
Not really, just a couple of small points. We can't make a compartment entry, and that means obviously the compartment we refer to in London Fire Brigade is the room or flat on fire. That's the compartment. We have to have a confirmed water supply before we do that. The way we do that in London Fire Brigade is that, again, to make sure our crews are safe, we plug in or put our hose into the dry riser from the floor below the 5th floor, and that allows crews that they've got a firefighting media or water supply to progress up to the 5th floor into unknown conditions. Because high-rise firefighting is challenging, once that initial crew has made entry into the compartment, we need to secure their access and egress and have a second crew to back them up. And generally what will happen is the second crew will plug in, if it's available, on the 5th floor. They'll plug their hose into the 5th floor and they'll back up and protect that first crew. The only change to that, if certain conditions or signs and symptoms within that compartment are evident, and that is a flashover or a backdraft, we should not be putting crews into that risk area if those certain conditions apply, because obviously crew safety is very, very paramount from an organisational point of view, but from an incident commander's point of view. If that happens, the backup crew has to be in place before we make a compartment entry for firefighter safety.
Just give me an idea of how hard and fast the rule or principle is about not putting firefighters into the compartment without a water supply.
It's the number one rule.
Number one rule.
There is no point putting a firefighter into a compartment on fire without firefighting media. Having said that, it's a very, very difficult place for a firefighter to be, because we're here to help. We want to help people. And if it's a person's reported fire, we know there's someone in there. And that's why things have to happen quickly to allow us to get there as quickly as we can, but professionally as well. We have to act professionally.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to ask you some detailed questions about arrival at the very beginning. I think we know from the records that G272, Golf 272 and Golf 271 arrived from North Kensington in that order at 59:24 and 59:28. I'm not testing you on your precise memory of those, but take it from me that that's what the log shows. So they were, you would call status 3 at that point. Were they the first appliances to arrive on scene in response to a call to a fire at Grenfell Tower that night?
Yes, they were.
They were. There was no appliance there before you?
No.
Now, I think you tell us you parked Golf 271 under the covered part of Grenfell Walk. Why did you park there?
That's, from pre-planning our previous visits, that's the perfect location for us to be able to get our hose at the quickest opportunity into the dry riser. So that was from pre-planning. It was a minimum of one length away from the dry riser inlet that allowed us to put water into that building. Okay,
and so you say pre-planning. In the pre-planning, did you know where the dry rising main outlet was?
Yes.
Right, where was it?
It was the main entrance on the south side of the tower to the left-hand side at the sort of ground floor level.
Very good. And did G2, Golf 272, I call it G272, arrive behind
yes.
G271? Where did G272 park?
Initially, it was just position just behind, from my memory, of Gov2 or G271.
Can you remember what you saw immediately you arrived, you personally?
My first recollection, when I dismounted the appliance, is that I walked round from where we were positioned on the Grenfell Walk to the east side, and I glanced up to the east elevation of Grenfell Tower, and or around the 4th floor level I could see an orange glow at a window of a compartment at the 4th floor level.
Now, in your statement on page 3, Mr. Dowden, if you can just be shown that, in the middle of the page, and I'm afraid there are no paragraph numbers that we can work from, so bear with me, but about halfway down the page you see it says, I dismounted the appliance and could see that there was a fire on the 4th floor level of the tower and could see a glow within the flat on the east side of the building. And then you say this, it seemed contained within the compartment. Was that your thought at the time?
Yes.
And standing there and seeing the fire, did you make any assumptions about whether the building complied with the rules and regulations about buildings, so far as compartmentation was concerned?
Not at that moment in time. That's not a thought. At dynamic stages of an incident, as an incident commander, that is not a thought process that will go through your mind, no.
Not, okay. Now, well, let me ask you this. Could you see from your initial look at the building that the exterior of the building was covered in a cladding or an envelope?
At that point, I wasn't aware that it was cladding. At that point, I just thought it was the external part of Grenfell Tower.
Did you look at the outside?
I would have looked at the outside, but I didn't make any conscious note or thought of what was on the external of that building, no.
Which pump was to be attached to the hydrant to obtain the water supply?
At that point, it was Gulf 271.
At that point, it was 271. Mm-hmm. And who took charge of that process?
Yeah. From memory, the two drivers of the appliances, so Firefighter Dan Bills, who was the driver of the pump ladder, Gulf 271, and also Firefighter Tom Abel, who was the driver of the pump, which is Gulf 272. That would be their role. That is part of their role as a driver to facilitate the water supplies.
Right. Did you, at that point, think of speaking to the responsible person? The person responsible for Grenfell Tower?
Again, not at that point, from my understanding, that some high-rise blocks within London, and particularly we do have some on our ground at North Kensington, have a 24-hour concierge. I wasn't aware that Grenfell Tower had a responsible person available at that point. So for me as an incident commander, the best information source we can have at that point would be residents.
Yes. In general terms, when you're fighting a high-rise fire, would you normally, at some point, speak to the person responsible for the building?
That could be a consideration if that person is on scene. At the dynamic stage of an incident, I know there would be an emergency or a contact for that block, but that's not something necessarily you'd have time or necessarily the time to contact at that point. If that responsible person was on scene at that moment in time, absolutely, yes.
Right. And might there come a point during the development of the fire or the firefighting or search and rescue that you would need to contact the person responsible for the building?
Yep, it is good. I would say good practice to liaise with a responsible person for that block, but that's not just alone to high-rise buildings. That's in any building we have. It'll be a good information source.
Yes. And in your experience as an incident commander, Mr. Dowden, have you ever had cause to contact the person responsible for the building during the course of firefighting?
Not remotely, i.e. by phone contact. Usually all my contact or conversation with a responsible person at an incident would be on scene.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll come back to that question as we go through some of the facts. Now, you, I think, have told us that you were the initial incident commander at the incident on the night. We can see, I think, from your training records that you had training in the role of incident command on a number of occasions before the 14th of June 2017. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. I'm just going to show you two policies. First of all, policy LFB 431, which is at tab 11. I'm not sure we've been to. So it's LFB 6048. And this is current as at the 18th of November 2014. Just looking at the first page, do you think you're familiar or were familiar on the night with that policy? Policy
Yes.
431. And the other one is in policy bundle 1, which is LFB policy 238, which is at LFB 50164. Incident command procedures, current as at April 2014. Again, as at the 14th of June 2017, do you remember being familiar with that policy?
I would be familiar with it, yes.
Right. And we know that you had training from your records in incident command decision making, but would that have included training on these policies?
The initial input, I think we spoke about it yesterday, was particularly when you go from a firefighter to a crew manager, you have your initial input, and that's when you sort of really get taught your instant command procedures and how it's set up. And then on these, the refresher training, this supervisor and managers in refresher course, instant command refresher course, and also at more local level, at station base, that's something I would facilitate as well. But I don't, outside of the instant command refresher courses, that I believe that I think every 2 years, then the training that I receive will be down to myself.
Right. Can I just explore that a little bit more? Could you please take, or be shown on the screen, tab 9, which is your training records? It's tab 9 of the bundle. That's it. And can I ask you to go to page 25, which is the entry for the 12th of May 2017. And if Mr. Trial Director, you could just highlight the 12th of May. There should be 3 entries there for the 12th of May 2017. Mr. Dowden, just bear with me. It's towards the bottom of it's about 2/3 of the way down the page. 12th of May. Yes, there, just got it. Right, so on the 12th of May, you'll see there are 3 entries in your training record, all theoretical station-based training. And the left-hand column shows decision-making model 341, and then training supervisor, incident management, incident command, decision-making model 341. And then below it, dynamic risk assessment, health and safety. and then underneath that, training supervisor, training notes, training dynamic risk assessment, training note. That's a chunk of training on the 12th of May 2017. Do you remember whether on that occasion you had training in incident command decision making?
Not facilitated for a brigade level, but that's a station-based level. So that would be for myself familiarising the decision-making model we spoke about yesterday, which helps us through that flowchart process, resource, gather information relating to an incident. So that would be a policy-based theory session.
Right, so not the two policies we've just been looking at, 431 or 238?
No, what that alludes to, incident management, incident command. So that decision-making model sits under sort of an umbrella of an instant command training package. So that's not the instant. That's not referring to those policies. No.
Okay. Could you then could we go to page 24, very bottom, same document, but back a page, very last entry, where on the 16th of March 2017, we can see the very last entry is management role. I'm so sorry, you're going to have to show the document, Mr. Trial Director, a little bit more widely so we can see what's on the left as well. If you go across the page, keep going. Yes, so there's your name, and then if you go back across to the right, training supervisor, 16th of March 17, and then above it, incident commander, management role, incident commander, incident commander. On that occasion, would you have been trained in policy 431 or policy 238, do you think?
I wouldn't have been trained. That again is a station-based level, and as you can see, training supervisor. So I would have, at a local level at station, that will refer to the policies we're talking about, instant commander.
It would?
Yeah, but that's not a centrally trained thing. That's at a local level at station.
Okay, but at local level, you would be receiving, is this right, receiving or giving training on policies?
Giving.
431?
I would be looking at getting that training, yes.
You're giving training on 431 and 238?
Yes.
Yes?
At a local level, yes.
Yes. And that's training, when you say you're giving it, is that in reference to training supervisor or both entries?
I don't believe training supervisor is a role. So that's not, from my understanding of how it works, that's not a policy, it's a role. Because obviously being a watch officer, the training supervisor is, when I check a certain box within that training record, it will say who is a lecturer or the training supervisor, and that's where that will become that's why that record is shown there.
I understand. And the one above it, I should have taken this a little bit more slowly. Incident commander, which is the second last entry there you see, is that you receiving training?
No, that they should be. That's the same with the same entry. So because I was the training supervisor, and the subject matter and the theory-based session would have been about incident command.
Okay, and then if we look a little bit higher up the page for the entries on the 19th of February 2017, we see again against your name, incident commander, management role, incident commander, and then underneath that training supervisor, management role, training supervisor, both entries for the 19th of February 2017. Again, is that the same?
That's the same. So if whoever the officer is delivering that training session or a theory-based session or practical session, if they are allocated as delivering the training, they will be the supervisor. It's not a specific policy or session, it's just a role.
Right. So can we assume that you were, as incident commander in the early part of 2017, very familiar with those two policies, 431 and 238, and had both had training on them and was giving training on them at a local level at least?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Now, can I then ask you to look at the first of those policies, policy 431, in tab 11 of the policy bundle. Now, given the relativity reference for that, 60 is 48. And can I ask you please to turn first of all to page 3, internal. And can we look? In fact, there's a quicker way of doing this, I think. Page 2. Mr. Trial Director, if you could please go back a page. Key point summary. And just in terms of this policy, the key point summary, is that, just so we know, that's a summary of the entire contents of the policy, is it?
It gives a snapshot of the sort of the main points within a policy, yes.
And in the middle, you can see role. The primary purposes of the Operational Incident Command is to save life. That's the first bullet point. You go down to the middle of the page. I'm sorry, the middle of the page. There. Role. The primary purposes of Operational Incident Command is to save life. And then there's a list of other things below that. Prevent further spread, loss, risk of injury, mitigate damage, mitigate environmental damage, and minimise disruption to the community. Are those listed in orders of priority?
Absolutely.
And then responsibilities. On arrival at an incident, the IC will wear the White Incident Command tabard. And then you have to assess the incident, establish priorities, and decide upon an overall operational plan using the DMM. And my question is, were you aware on arrival at Grenfell Tower as Incident Commander on the 14th June of that responsibility as Incident Commander?
Yes.
And so you were aware that the primary purpose of your role as Incident Commander was the saving of life?
Yes.
And then the other things below that?
Yes.
And you then, if you look at the third bullet point down, it says, you'll see it says, undertake an initial dynamic risk assessment and subsequent reviews of that dynamic risk assessment, or DRA. Following a DRA, a tactical mode must be declared. This process will be continuous throughout the incident. Just so that I understand it, is the dynamic risk assessment, or the DRA, a reference to policy 341, the decision-making model, or is it something else?
Separate policy.
It's a separate policy?
Yep.
All right, we may need to come back to that.
I can explain if you want me to.
Yes, please do.
A snapshot of that policy. A dynamic risk assessment, what that allows us, it does work alongside the decision-making model. And what basically that does is it allows us as incident commanders, not just incident commanders, everyone has that responsibility on the fire ground from firefighter up to, dynamic risk assessment for themselves and others. But particularly for an incident commander, that allows us to basically, by policy or our safe systems of work, choose and formulate a plan to help us move forward into the hazard area. And the tactical mode is, so if I have dynamically risk assessed it, working through my decision-making model, I've chose whether it's a safe system, we're in this late high-rise would be high-rise procedure. And then if I'm commit personnel to a hazard zone, I make a compartment entry into the fire, the tactical mode, there's two tactical modes. One is Oscar, one is Delta. The relation to that is Oscar is offensive, it means we're committing personnel to a hazard zone because I have the right resources, I've chosen my safe systems of work, I'm happy that my firefighters are as safe as can be to make an entry and, as it said, the priority is to save life or extinguish fire. And the Delta is defensive. I don't think it's safe, I don't have the right resources in place to commit personnel to the hazard zone.
Thank you very much, that's very clear. So, on arrival at Grenfell Tower on the night of the 14th, or morning of the 14th of June 2017, did you undertake an initial dynamic risk assessment?
It's something, it's an instinctive thing. It's something you've been given training. I don't turn up and think I've got to do a dynamic risk assessment. I know it sounds strange, but as an incident commander, that's something that you are trained to do. We all do that as individuals, members of the public. We do dynamic risk assessment every single day. Or shall I walk across that road? No, I won't. We do that assessment anyway. As an organisation, we have to have a process behind that and a policy behind that to refer to and to give training from. But as an incident commander, turn up at an incident from experience, from training, from input. That is something that is done as a natural. We do that as yes. So I won't say that I consciously I must make a dynamic assessment. I look from my experiences, from policy, from training, from my situational awareness on that incident ground at that moment in time. I will do a dynamic risk assessment, and that will allow me to make my decision in terms of, okay, have I got enough resources? Is it safe to put personnel within that hazard zone?
And having done an instinctive, I think, dynamic risk assessment you've been describing, can you tell us what that was? What was the assessment that you initially performed?
You have to gather certain information first, okay? And what I think I spoke about yesterday, the thing you're looking at is life, fire and hazard. Because obviously the number one priority in London Fire Brigade is to save life. And as an incident commander, you have to gather some information first before you can make that dynamic risk assessment. So on that night, I was approached by the resident of flat 16, and we have to ask a certain amount of questions that will lead us to allow us to make that dynamic risk assessment. Those questions will be along the lines of, okay, find out if that is the responsible resident of that block or building or premise. Do they have information of where is the fire located? What is on fire? How long has the fire been burning for? Is anyone involved? Are any persons involved? That's a really important part, because that really changes your thought process as an incident commander. Are there any hazards within that property, that building? Depending on what answers are surrendered, and that allows you to formulate your plan as an incident commander. So on the night of the fire at Grenfell Tower, initially when I turned up, I did have that dialogue with the resident of flat 16, confirmed that the fire is in flat 16. It is on the fourth floor. The fire was in the kitchen. He believed it was his fridge that was on fire. And I asked the question once, is there anyone inside the building? He confirmed no, and I reiterated that just to confirm my understanding. You can guarantee me that there's no one in flat 16, everyone else is out, and to that the reply was no.
Right, that's very helpful, Mr. Dowden. I'm going to come back just to explore that a little bit more in a moment, because we've got some evidence to look at. Before we do, can I just ask you to keep on this page and go down a couple of bullet points. This is page 2 of the Policy 431, and just look at the bullet point that says develop an effective organisational incident command structure and communications network. Did you do that on arrival at Grenfell Tower?
Yes, I say I would.
What did you do?
And the reasons for that, so the incident command structure, as incident command, referring back to the policy, we look at things called spans of control.
Sorry, spans?
Spans of control. So that means your lines of communication, your information sources coming into you as an incident commander. Comfortable amount is 3 lines of spans of control, lines of communication coming to you. So that may well be your information gathering to the initial sources of a resident, occupier, owner, different agencies. We want to try and limit that to 3. The optimum that you should be operating at as an incident commander is 5 spans of control. Anything beyond that, it gets really, really difficult to try and process that information. So my incident command structure, based on that, and referring to high-rise policy, was that I would remain at the real initial point of that incident, dynamic stage of that incident, I would remain at ground floor level, outside of Grenfell Tower, because I need to have a situational awareness of what's going on outside and around, and be able to liaise with oncoming agencies, further resources. In terms of how that would have worked, I briefed my crew manager at the time, Chris Secret. He was to be in charge of operations at the bridgehead. So he's basically my eyes and ears on the bridgehead, and he'll be committing resources from there to the fire compartment. In terms of communications network, the incident command channel which I was on was channel 1, and that's how I would liaise with crew manager Secret up at the bridgehead. All BA teams would observe channel 6, which is our breathing apparatus communications channel.
And what about communications back to brigade control?
That will be facilitated via the main scheme radio. So on every frontline pumping appliances, we have our main scheme radio, and that's how we on the fire ground will be able to communicate back to control.
And I'm sorry to go right away into a question I was probably going to ask you this afternoon, but never mind. You've got the main scheme radio linking control to pump 271, which is the command unit.
No.
No?
No, the Golf 271 isn't a command unit. It's totally separate. That's a separate function. That is a specific vehicle. So Golf 271 is a pumping appliance, pump ladder. In the dynamic stage of an incident, we can identify a pumping appliance as an instant command pump. And I believe that function went to Golf 272 that night.
272, right.
Yes. The only reason why that happened, you can't confuse the two. We have to have the machine supplying water to whether it's a high-rise block, a commercial premise, or even if it's the firefighting pump supplying water. You can understand that the diesel pump is revving. There's a lot of work, a lot of noise around that machine. Okay, so the theory behind it is we have to have a separate machine that will be allocated as an instant command pump, and that will be facilitating message via the main scheme radio to the fire ground. That's in theory how it should work.
I see. So main scheme radio links control to the command unit,
Yeah.
whatever it is, and then is there somebody in the command unit who is on the other end of the radio?
So do you just repeat that question?
Yes,
please?
who is it? Let me put it this way. Who stays within the command unit on the incident ground to receive radio messages coming on the main scheme radio from control?
So if it's not. So if we're talking about the instant command vehicle or pump at that time, the ICP as we call it on the fire ground, then the theory is that a driver will facilitate taking those messages from control via the designated machine.
Right.
It does happen at the very, very early stages of a dynamic incident, which Grenfell Tower was extremely dynamic. That sometimes is difficult to facilitate because of how quickly your resources can be consumed on the fire ground.
Yeah.
And apart from having a driver or a person on that vehicle, we have no way of communicating with control.
So you're standing outside with a radio on the ground floor. Do you communicate directly with Brigade control, or do you communicate with the command unit, who then communicates with Brigade control?
I think we really need to be clear. It's not a command unit. We need to be. It's a separate function. It's a separate vehicle. So the ICP, we refer to the ICP, the instant command pump, because that is at the initial stage of an incident. That is a pumping appliance that will be dedicated a role of the instant command vehicle. When a command unit, which is a vehicle which comes on at a later point, a resourcing point, that's the command unit. There are two separate vehicles and functions. But you're right. The only way I, as an officer in charge at a watch manager-based level, have a fireground radio, so I don't have the function to communicate directly to control from the fireground. The only way that we can do that through frontline pumping appliances is via the main scheme radio, which is on all frontline pumping appliances.
Yeah, that's very clear, thank you. Now, can I just ask you to look at policy 238, just one or two questions on that, which is policy bundle tab 1, incident command procedures. And just picking up your point about ICP, just so I've got it in my head in policy terms, if you look at page 2 internally of policy 238, this is the key point summary. And if you look at halfway down that bullet point list, just under the bold letters I'm taking over, can you see it says an initial command pump, ICP, will be established as soon as possible? And it goes on to say, whenever more than one pumping appliance is in attendance, headlights and blue beacons should remain on to identify it. And just so that we're all absolutely clear, on arrival at Grenfell Tower on the night, which was the initial command pump? I think you said it was 272.
From my understanding and referring back to my statement, the decision was taken for Gov or G272 to be the ICP.
Right. And so would it follow from that, well, let me ask you in a more neutral way, who would have been the main scheme radio operator communicating with Brigade Control in G272?
Yeah. Ideally, it would be the driver of that appliance, but that's not always the case. You know, we all have a responsibility, either as an incident commander, it could be a role of a firefighter, depending on what resource was available at that time.
Just tell me, would one of your crew be assigned to be the radio operator unless he's taken off it, so to speak? So he'd stay there until he got some other order?
Not necessarily, no.
So,
Depending on how resourcing goes at a real dynamic stages of an incident, because obviously we have to weigh up, okay, we need water to get into that building, so at that moment in time both the drivers were exhausted in terms, consumed in terms of facilitating the hydrant and the dry riser supply. So it's not a case of that if we had the luxury of having 6 or maximum ridership levels on the fire appliances, then yes, that may well be the case, but generally the ridership levels aren't at the maximum. We generally ride at a minimum. That night we're riding 5 and 5, but so it's not as if if we have the resource to enough personnel, and that is a good practice to adopt.
but what I'd like to know is when you get to the fire and you designate 272 as the ICP, does one of the crew know that he is the radio operator subject to being called to do other things, or is it just a case of who happens to be close enough to hear the radio?
No. So it should generally be the driver that takes that role. But everyone on the fireground has to have an understanding of that. That's how that theory works. If needed be, that they could take radio messages and traffic if required.
Yeah, thank you.
And just one more question on this communications point. If you go on in this same policy to page 5, you can see there is a heading under section 7, functions of initial command pump, ICP, and this covers that. And if you look at paragraph 7.4, it says the ICP will provide the communications link between Brigade Control and the IC and remain the incident focal point until relieved by the CU. Is that what you were referring to earlier when you said that the initial pump is the ICP?
That's correct.
And then what is the difference then between, so far as the communications link is concerned, between the ICP and the CU?
So could you repeat that question
Yes,
for me,
what's the
please?
difference between the ICP and the CU?
The command unit is purely for instant command. It's not a firefighting appliance. It doesn't carry any water, doesn't carry any firefighting equipment. It's purely to facilitate better command and control structure and assist the instant commander at any incident.
Yeah. And just a couple of questions on the main scheme radio. Whereabouts is that situated in a pump? Is it on the vehicle?
That's correct. It's in the front cab where the officer in charge sits and the driver sits. And it's located roughly sort of at head height. You've got a radio sort of display, and then you've got a handheld press-to-talk receiver and receiver that you'll be able to send your radio traffic to control and receive traffic as well.
And can it be removed from the vehicle? Can you use it portably?
No, you can't.
You can't. So someone needs to be physically sitting in the ICP at all times in order to monitor and receive those radio messages.
That's the theory, yes.
That's the theory. Yeah. And just going back a page in the same policy to paragraph 5, the incident commander, IC, and look at paragraph 5.5. That says that it is essential that action in the very early stages of the incident supports the overall plan. The IC will therefore need to make a positive decision as to the purpose and manner in which to commit initial resources, the IC will, through reference to the decision-making model, DMM, assess the situation, establish priorities, and decide upon an overall operational plan. My question is, did you do that? Did you assess the situation, establish priorities, and decide upon an operational plan on arrival at Grenfell Tower?
Yes.
And what was your overall operational plan? Can you remember?
From the moment we turned up in the early stages of that incident, my operational plan was to commit crews once we had established the safe system of work as per high-rise policy, commit crews from the bridgehead, and to make a compartment entry and put that fire out.
At that stage, did you consider the risk of failure of compartmentation?
From memory, I would say yes, because my recollection is we had a covering jet on the external ready. As I said, compartmentation does fail, and that's not something that's uncommon in fires. Weak points, windows, doors. Moving away from just high-rise premises, it's a good practice to have a covering jet out, particularly to protect firefighters' access and egress into a premise. And from my understanding and that was facilitated by one of my drivers, Dan Bills, we had a covering jet out because it was on the fourth floor. If it was higher up the building, that would be more difficult to facilitate because, limitations of our firefighting jets don't necessarily reach a certain amount of floors. But because of where the fire was on the fourth floor, I do believe that quite early on we had a covering jet out, laid out, ready in case compartmentation failed on the external of the building.
Now, this was a four-pump fire because the predetermined attendance for high-rise is 4 pumps. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And although initially the make-up was 3, it was very quickly corrected by Brigade control. That's a matter of record. Does that accord with your recollection?
That's correct. I received further traffic en route to Grenfell Tower that the PDA had been made up to the correct amount of appliances because it had been identified as a high-rise block, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, under the LFB's make-up policy, their mobilisation policy, as it stood at the time of the fire, did you know what the personnel requirements for a 4-pump fire were?
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, the personnel requirements. Did you know what level of officer was required to attend at a 4-pump fire?
So, as a watch manager B, that's my sort of. There's 2 levels of. We're trained to either level 1 or level 2 instant command. So, for me, up to watch manager B level, I'm trained to instant command level 1, and that's generally I operate to anything up to 4 pumping appliances. With that, you'll get a station manager that who will be not necessarily attend, who will be notified by pager as a monitoring officer to monitor that incident.
At the time of arrival at Grenfell Tower on the night, do you know whether you had a station manager paged to attend as a monitoring officer?
That information would have been available via the tip sheet we spoke about yesterday that comes through the watch room. So I would have been aware at that point that there was a monitoring officer on there.
Do you remember who the station manager was?
I don't remember at that point in time, but obviously since that, I do know who that monitoring officer was, yes.
Who was that?
It was station manager Andy Walton.
Andy Walton. And do you remember what time he arrived on scene?
No, I don't.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn to a different topic.
Yes.
It may be convenient for us
Good
now
point
to
to
take
have a break.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. You'd probably quite like a break now, wouldn't you?
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Dowden. All right, well, we'll break, I'm going to say for 5 minutes, let's say until 25 to 11, and I shall want to be back in promptly at 25 to 11.
Thank you.
Off you go. Thank you very much. Right.
Yep.
Good.
Fine,
Okay.
thank you.
Yes, Mr. Willett?
Mr. Dowden, can I just go back to something to do with communications at the initial command pump and the radio? Is there a speaker which is contained on the outside of an ordinary pump ladder or pump, which would allow people around the pump to hear what messages are coming in to the ICP from Brigade Control?
That's correct. There is, in the pump bay, there is a loudspeaker that we can turn on that will allow us to do that, yes.
Right. So it's in the pump bay, is it?
Yes.
Whereabouts on the vehicle is that?
The rear of the, at the rear of the appliance.
Right. Do you remember whether you had those turned on the night?
I can't, no.
Would it be normal to have those turned on?
That is a good practice to adopt, yeah. But I can't confirm if that was on the night.
Right. Why would you not have the speakers turned on?
The only reason for that would be that an individual has forgot to actuate the button to turn that on.
And who would that normally be?
That would generally be down to the designated driver of that vehicle.
Yeah. Now, going back to your statement, page 3, just below halfway down, you say, I was wearing my high visibility incident commander tabard. And at that point, a male came up to me and stated that the fire was in his flat on the 4th floor. Can we just have a look at some photographs? If you turn, please, in the documents bundle to tab 18. Tab 18. This is a photograph taken at just after 1 a.m. Tab 18, and it's it's INQ 7 zeros and then 9. There it is. And I wonder if that can be blown up for you. This is a still taken from the CCTV cameras in the entrance lobby to Grenfell Tower at, as I say, just after 1 a.m. Can you identify yourself?
That's myself with the high visibility jerking on, and on the back is the red incident commander tabard insert.
Right.
So that is myself with the white helmet and the high visibility jacket. Yeah, that's me.
Very good. And are you able to identify who else we see in that picture?
The firefighter directly in front of me is firefighter Dorgu. The firefighter entering by the main entrance is firefighter Danny Brown. I'm not 100% sure. I think the firefighter, as you can see with the hose, the entry control board and the forward information board, I think is firefighter Badillo.
Badillo, right. And in his left hand, he's got two things. He's got the entry control board and the
forward information board.
Forward information board, right. And could you please turn to bundle tab 19 next, which should be another picture, which is INQ 6026. That is the picture of a male walking into the building. Can you identify from that picture perhaps whether this was the male that you say you spoke to? I have a better picture in case you can't. Let me try.
It's difficult to identify from that angle.
Well, perhaps we can go to the next one, which is tab 20, INQ 6044. where there's a picture of his face and whole person. Do you think that was the male that you spoke to when you arrived?
I would say it bears a resemblance, yes.
Do you remember where he came up to you and spoke to you? Was it inside the building or outside?
From my memory and my recollection of that night, it was outside that I spoke to him.
As well as you can remember, what were the man's exact words?
Again, it was more in response to the questions that I was asking the gentleman in terms of the fire confirmed was on the 4th floor. It was a gentleman's flat. It was in the kitchen. It was his fridge that was on fire. And he confirmed to me twice that there was no one else within that property or that compartment of flat 16.
Now, I'm going to play, if I can, an audio of a call that he made to the London Fire Brigade at 1 a.m. and 21 seconds, and it's MET 000148885, Mr. Trial Director. And I'm going to play it, and I'd just like you to listen very carefully, if you can, to this very start of the call. We may have to play it twice, but I just want to ask you some questions about what we can hear in that call. Could it please be played?
Hello. Hello. It's 4th floor. What's on fire? I think it's starting in the fridge. In the fridge? Yeah. All right. No one there.
Hello.
Hello. Huh?
Hello, you called 999. Do you need to please?
Could you could stop?
Hello.
That. If you could just play that once more, because it's quite a confusing audio track. And I'll ask you the question before we play it again. My question is, do you know to whom the caller, who we've identified as Mr. Kebede, the occupant of flat 16, but do you know who he might have been speaking to? You could that's the question. So we'll play it again and see if you can identify
Can I just so we are talking about the actual background, who he's talking to, referring to at the instant ground or in terms of remote at control?
No, in the background.
Right,
it sounds as if he's speaking to somebody who is there present with him at the same time as speaking to somebody in control. And I just want to know whether we can identify the person he's speaking to. If you could just play that again, please.
Hello. Hello. It's 4th floor. What's on fire? I think it's starting in the fridge. In the fridge? Yeah. All right. No one there.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay.
Huh?
Hello, you...
That's all we need. Do you think you can identify the person who Mr. Kebede was speaking to?
Don't think so, no. It's
Okay, all right.
difficult.
Did the man you spoke to say anything that made you think that this was more than an ordinary kitchen fire?
There was no information surrendered to think, apart from the information I gathered, that would suggest it was anything other than a compartment fire within a tower block, no.
And if you go back to your statement, you go on, after having described this discussion, to implementing the high-rise procedure, and then you say the firefighters were taking the necessary equipment from the appliances while I was speaking to the male, and they were establishing a water supply in order to charge the dry riser. Could you just describe for us the process which was going on at that time in terms of charging the dry riser? What was happening?
So, again, this is something that would generally be facilitated by, and it was that night, by the two drivers of the fire appliances. So first we have to obtain a water supply into our fire engine, and that's from a hydrant source. So we have to take a certain piece of equipment off our fire engine, locate the hydrant, connect our piece of equipment to the opening at ground level on this hydrant, and then plug our hoses into the hydrant key and bar and outlet, which then we run the hose into the back of the fire engine. And then at the same time, it should be a simultaneous activity if we have two people doing it. From the back of the fire engine, we will then run the hose or augment the hose into the dry riser outlet. Grenfell Tower was on the south elevation of the building to the left-hand side of the main entrance. Once we've done that and we've connected the hoses up, we turn on the hydrant, then we get a water supply to the fire engine. Once that's confirmed, we can then charge the supply to the dry riser, and that allows us then to put water into the building. So it's not, depending on what we spoke about earlier, there are a number of mitigating factors in terms of the quickness and the rapidity of that. If the hydrant is in easy access, it's not obstructed, if it's operable, then that's something that will be facilitated generally by the drivers of the fire engines.
Do you remember, Mr. Dowden, where the hydrant was located that you plugged into?
Not from memory, no.
Do you remember anything about any difficulties with access to it?
No.
Do you remember any difficulties initially with water pressure?
No.
Slightly different topic. Mr. O'Keefe, who is from Kensington 331, he has provided us with a statement that says that you contacted him on the radio while he was status 2, so mobile to incident. Do you remember a conversation with Mr. O'Keefe at an early stage?
Yeah, I do refer to that in my statement, because obviously I had a confirmed fire on the full floor. I believe to both Brian O'Keefe, who was the officer in charge of Golf 331, and also to crew manager Dave Davies, who was the officer in charge of Golf 362, through my handheld radio, to those two oncoming appliances. I gave them some traffic in terms of I would request a pair of BA wearers, a set of BA wearers from both trucks to report to, as soon as I get to the incident ground, to report to the bridgehead on the second floor.
Yes, thank you. Now, it's a matter of record that Kensington Golf 331 arrived at 1:08 a.m. So does that tally with your recollection of when in the incident you spoke to Mr. O'Keefe?
It would have been prior to their arrival, because that was when they was en route to the incident.
And what had you seen at that point that prompted you to make the request to have the crews in BA, breathing apparatus?
I can't remember any significant visual or event that made me make that decision. It was more of a case of, I know from input and training that high-rises can be quite challenging incidents, particularly for firefighters, resource heavy in terms of personnel. So from thinking it was more of a contingency than there was a particular event or a visual that I saw that made me make that decision.
Now, in your statement a little bit lower down page 3, 4 lines up from the bottom, you say, I briefed crew manager Secret, who was in charge of G272, of the information I had obtained from the mail from flat 16 and requested that he go to the second floor and establish the bridgehead. Can you just explain the command structure at that moment?
So the command structure is that I was the incident commander, and I would remain at ground level to facilitate oncoming appliances officers to give them a brief, and then Chris Secret, who was to be in charge of the bridgehead, and that would be committing BA crews to liaise obviously with myself for Channel 1, making sure BA crews are on Channel 6, and if he would need any more resources, that would have to come through himself, and I could further resource the incident.
Did you then send in 2 BA wearers to the fire compartment?
once we had the bridge had set up and that was confirmed, and we had confirmed water supply, which I did get traffic back from crew manager Stickett, that was the case, then I was happy for compartment entry to be made, yes.
And it's a matter of record that you sent in Charlie Batterby, the crew manager from G271, and Danny Brown, firefighter Danny Brown, a firefighter from G271 as well, to flat 16.
That's correct.
That's right. Do you remember, how did they get into the tower? How did they get up into the tower?
From memory, it would have been via the main entrance on the south elevation of the building.
Were you aware that the internal door needed an electronic key to get through the security system?
If I'm from the familiarisation of this, I believe that information was surrendered, but at that moment in time when I was at the dynamic stages of the incident, I don't think I had a recall that needing it, no.
So did nobody in your crew radio to you or tell you that they couldn't get through from the main entrance into the lift lobby because the door was electronically secured?
I don't recall that, no.
Okay. Once you've sent firefighters Batterby and Brown into the tower, where did you go, or where did you stand?
From my recollection, the majority of the early parts of that incident and throughout when I was incident commander, I was on and outside of the tower, particularly looking up at the east elevation of the Grenfell Tower.
Now, it's a matter of record that 331, Kensington 331, G331 I should call it, arrived at 1:08. Do you remember who the crew manager was on G331?
I believe at that time it was crew manager Jamal Stern.
Jamal Stern. Do you remember being asked to check by anybody from G331 whether the fire was spreading?
I can't recall that, no.
Okay. Now, at the top of page 4 of your statement, you say, once they had entered the building, crew manager Secret informed me via the radio that the fire lift was not working. I just want to ask you about that. How did Mr. Secret inform you? Was it by radio?
That's my recollection, yes.
And that's a radio communication between the bridgehead and you as the incident commander, is it?
Yeah, I don't know if he would have been at the bridge at that point, because at that point he may have been trying to secure the fire lift, which would have been at ground floor level.
You're quite right. You're quite right. It's my fault. But the radio that Mr. Secret had was a radio that he would have used and was intending to use, is this right, from the bridgehead once he'd established it?
That's correct.
Right, okay. And those communications between you and him by radio were working, were they, at that point?
Up to that point, yes.
And just casting your mind back and looking at your statement, can you remember exactly what Mr. Secret said about the fire lift not working?
From my recollection, referred to a statement, the traffic I received from crew manager Secret was that he had tried to command the fire lift and he was unable to do that. Yep.
Did he explain to you what it was about the lift that wasn't working that should have been?
I can't recall any further explanation, but my assumption would have been that how a firefighting lift works is that we take control, we override that by using the lift key, so we can utilise equipment, personnel, and also the rescue of casualties, particularly if it's on the upper floors within a high-rise block.
Yeah. And I'm going to come back to that at some point because I'm interested in it. But just at the moment, I just want to know what you were thinking and what you knew about what the lift could and couldn't do. So my question is, did Mr. Secret or Firefighter Secret explain to you what it was about the lift that wasn't working as it should have been? Did he tell you what was wrong with it?
Not from my memory, no.
Did it occur to you at the time that the lift wasn't in fact a full firefighting lift? To give you all the functionality of a firefighting lift?
I wasn't aware at that time, no.
What assumptions did you make at the time about what the lift could do in terms of attacking the fire and carrying out search and rescue?
At that point in the fire, it provided us the opportunity to not have to carry equipment and personnel via the staircase. It gives us a quicker access to fire floors. In the case of Grenfell Tower, the fire was on the fourth floor, so the distance between the ground and where we set the bridgehead was only 2 floors. If the fire floor was further up the building, it would have been more of an issue, if I'm honest.
And in terms of functionality, where you can take control, as you say, of the lift using the lift key, in terms of that functionality, what benefits would that bring you as a fire crew in terms of firefighting and search and rescue?
Initially, it's the speed of access to get to the bridgehead, because obviously time is very, very key in particularly high-rise fires. We can leave the lift at the bridgehead level. So if we rescue any casualties, again we have ease and quick rapidity of getting the casualty out of the building and to a point of care.
And what about later on? What other benefits would having control over the lift give you in terms of rescue?
Could you just repeat that question?
Yes. What benefits would having complete control over the lift give you in terms of rescue?
It would refer back to the same probably 2 points in terms of being able to get our personnel into the building and up to the 5 floors quicker. In relation to Grenfell Tower, it was difficult because the fire was on the 4th floor, so we shouldn't really. It's difficult. You don't want to be going beyond the 5th floor in any lift in a high-rise block. So it would only really be to transport personnel equipment up to the bridgehead level, not beyond.
In your experience, are there any risks to the occupants of the building during a fire in leaving the lift to be completely uncontrolled by the fire brigade?
Yes.
What are they?
If it's completely uncontrolled by the fire brigade, then that could lead to potentially residents using the lift in a fire, and potentially that's compromised. And then wherever the residents or occupants of that block may open the doors onto a 5th floor or an area that's compromised. So that's why we generally will take command of it, so we can have control over that.
So the consequences of the fire brigade not having control of the lifts are serious, are they?
They can be, yes.
Can be. Do you know why the firefighting lift was out of order?
No.
What was the immediate impact on your firefighting plans of the firefighting lift not working?
Initially, there could have been a small delay and getting equipment up to the bridgehead. But as I said, because it was on the 2nd floor, there was only a minimal travel distance from ground to 2nd floor.
Is there, was there, an LFB plan or strategy for what should happen if the firefighting lift is out of order?
It's one of two things. You can either have to utilise the stairwell, or, as in the case I believe on that night, the crews, I believe, still actually use the lift to go up to the bridgehead.
And what, if the lift was out of order and not being capable of brought under control of the fire brigade, what would you do to minimise the risks to occupants using it?
Looking at it now, the only thing we potentially could do is isolate the power supply to it. I don't think that was something that was done on that night.
Would that be a normal thing to do?
Not normal, no.
No. And can I ask you this? How normal, in your experience, is it when you arrive at a fire in a high-rise block to find that the lifts are either out of order or not being capable of being brought under LFB control?
In my own experience, I've not come across that before. Any operational incident, no.
Right. If the firefighting lift was out of order, how would that affect firefighting operations in the event that the fire didn't remain in its compartment of origin?
The potential there is to for residents still to use that and obviously the advice is not to use lifts in any fire incident, particularly in high-rise blocks. But obviously residents react differently in those situations. It's stressful, it's disorientating. Potentially, if they use a lift, that could expose them to real risk.
Yeah. So, if things turned out that the fire had spread beyond the compartment of origin, in this case flat 16, how would your plan of action, would your plan of action then take account of the fact that the firefighting lift had failed?
Could you just repeat that?
Certainly. If things turned out that the fire had spread beyond the compartment of origin, flat 16 in this case, would your plan of action then seek to take account of the fact that you no longer, or you didn't have a firefighting lift that worked?
At the night of Grenfell Tower fire, when I received that information from Crew Manager Chris Secret, it was very early on in the incident, and from my knowledge that the fire was still contained in the compartment, so I hadn't, at that point in time, I hadn't made a plan. That hadn't come into my thought process, no.
Now, going back to your statement, you say, after the reference to the lift not working, that in high-rise incidents, you set up the bridgehead 2 floors below the fire and you plug into the dry riser on the floor below. And I think you've explained already this morning some of that practice. In the first main paragraph of page 4 of your statement, we can just go to that, I think we're on it, you say that you received radio traffic from CM Secret that the crew had plugged their hose in on the fire floor as the fire floor was not compromised at that point. Was that in accordance with normal firefighting strategy in a high-rise building?
That's not as it is in Policy 633. However, for me, to change that decision would have meant that we'd have had to bring the crews back down another floor, so there would have been a further delay or a delay in making a compartment entry. So, as an incident commander, I received that information from Chris Secret. If the traffic had come back to me to say that actually no, the fire floor is compromised, there is, it's carbonation, there's smoke-filled environment, then yes, I don't want my firefighters put any undue risk, so I would have given the direction to make sure that they came to the floor below. But because that area was not compromised, I was happy. I made that decision to continue with the firefighting operations from the fire floor.
But is it right that Mr. Secret would not have known whether the lobby on the 4th floor was compromised with smoke until he got there?
Yeah, that's correct.
But he was going there without water?
At that point, yes, correct.
Yeah. So how did it work? Did he go up to the 4th floor and then make the decision himself to plug into the dry riser there and then tell you afterwards? Or did he brief you first as to the conditions on the 4th floor before he plugged into the dry riser on that floor?
I can't recall. The only information I remember receiving back was that they were plugging in on the fire floor already.
Right, so it looks as if, from what you're saying, is that he'd gone up, looked at it, saw it was clear of smoke and made his own decision to plug into the dry riser there and then told you about it.
That's correct. And
is that a fair summary?
Yeah, he's a competent officer.
Yes.
You know, and sometimes we have to do a little, you know, a recce, want for a better word, to get a bit more situational awareness within that building. You know, what the conditions are like, and you know, Chris being a responsible and competent officer, then you know he made that decision. I will stand by that.
Yes. And in the next sentence of your statement, in the same paragraph, you say, "I was happy for crews to be committed from the fire floor as I felt that we had to be aggressive in tackling this fire." Why did you feel you had to be aggressive in tackling this fire?
I think, referring back to the 6 weeks prior, we had the incident at Trellick Tower. We had the water failure. I think that was an eye-opener that, for me, particularly as an incident commander, I wanted to be on the, you know, to not to have those potential issues at this fire. I wanted to be on the ball, for want of a better word. And I know that within, you know, high-rise blocks, you know, you have to try and, you know, time is of the essence. You have to make a compartment quite quickly but safely. And I was conscious that I didn't want a further delay. If I was to bring the crews back down, then that would be a further delay into making a compartment entry into flat 16.
So was there anything about this fire that would mean that you would adopt a more aggressive strategy in attacking it than you would normally?
Not necessarily, no. Not at that point.
Now, in the next sentence of your witness statement, you say, "I requested that a support crew were to go to the 3rd floor to secure their water supply and progress to the 4th floor to support the initial firefighting crew." Does that mean that you asked the support crew to plug into the dry riser on the 3rd floor as well?
No, so that was still within the traffic, radio traffic between me and Chris Secret, because that's, as a policy 633 states, that's generally where the first initial crew should go plug in 1 floor below the fire floor. But obviously, because they plugged in onto the fire floor, where the backup crew, so that the roles are almost swapped.
Right.
So I was very conscious that we needed, obviously, to secure a safe access and egress for crews and into that compartment, that they were to plug in on the floor below the fire floor, the 3rd floor.
I follow, thank you. Yeah. So that would mean that there would be effectively 4 firefighters, 2 teams of 2, is this right, using 2 hoses from 2 dry risers, 1 on the 3rd floor and 1 on the 4th floor?
That's correct.
And would that be normal for an apparently ordinary kitchen fire in a compartment in a high-rise building?
That's the expectation, yeah.
Yes. Now, just focusing a little bit more, if we can, on the use of dry risers on 2 floors, I just want to ask you a few questions about that. The first question is, would simultaneous use of 2 dry risers, well, let me ask it in a different way. What effect on the water pressure available in each hose would the simultaneous use of 2 dry risers have?
It shouldn't have any effect. The minimum requirement, what a dry riser should allow us to do, is provide 1,500 litres of water per minute. What we do is we charge that at ground floor level from the pumping appliance, and that should be at 10 bar. And that allows for frictional loss within the dry riser. So the firefighting jets we had working on the 3rd and 4th floor, they should be set at for firefighting operations at 230 litres per minute. So that's 460 litres per minute. So that shouldn't exhaust the requirements of at 1,500 litres per minute.
Right, that's very clear. My next question is, would the use of the dry riser and a hose plugged into it on the third floor mean that you then had to pull the hose, or your crew had to pull the hose up 2 flights of stairs in the protected staircase?
That's correct. So sufficient hose would have had to have been laid out, and then the firefighting crew would have made their way up to the 4th floor with a charge length. That's correct.
Would that result in the door on both the 3rd and the 4th floor from the staircase into the lobbies on each floor being propped open by the hose?
That's correct.
Would that mean that any smoke from the 4th floor lobby would leak into the staircase?
That's correct.
So in general terms, how would the practice of setting a hose into a dry riser on the 3rd floor and then running it up to the 4th floor lobby keep the protected staircase protected from the ingress of smoke?
Because of the way Grenfell Tower was set up, the dry riser outlets were in the flat lobby areas. Generally, the principle, the dry rise outlet should be in a protected stairwell. Yes, there is going to be some compromise of that because we have to get water into a compartment, and it may well come into the stairwell. But so if you, for the initial crew, plug in the floor below, if it was in a protected stairwell and not in a lobby area of the flats, they would plug in the protected stairwell, go to the floor above, and then into the fire floor.
So what would you say about the position of the dry riser outlets in Grenfell Tower in the lobbies? Would the position of those outlets be something that would affect your firefighting operations?
Potentially.
And would the position of those outlets potentially affect the integrity of the single protected staircase in terms of whether it remained protected?
Yes.
Can I ask you to look at policy 633 again, which is in the policy bundle at tab 4. And I've just got a couple more questions on this before I go to ask the chairman to break, Mr. Dowden. So if you look at policy 633, I'd like you to go, please, to page, paragraph 7.2 on page 9. And this is under the heading Operational Procedure Securing Water Supplies for Firefighting. And you can see paragraph 7.2, which is about a DRM, a dry rising main. And I just want to ask you about the second part of that paragraph. It says, when laid on stairways, hose should be positioned in such a way that it minimises obstruction. Were you aware, when you attended Grenfell Tower, of that requirement in policy 633?
I would have been, yep.
And looking in the same policy back a little bit at paragraph 2.43, which is on page 6, page 6, 2.43, firefighting operations may breach firefighting lobbies, increasing risk to occupants and impacting on personnel at the bridgehead. And then in the last sentence it says, it will be necessary to run hose lines onto protected routes and stairways to undertake the firefighting, and this will allow smoke to spread into previously unaffected areas of the building. Were you aware of that risk identified in policy 633 when you attended Grenfell on the night of the fire?
I would have been aware, yes.
Yes. Did you take any steps to ensure that the obstruction that's identified in that policy could be minimised?
it's difficult. We can only work with what we're given on a night in terms of what that building presents to us. We have to have a water supply. We have to put water onto that fire. We can only work with the facilities that are given to us at that moment in time. It's good practice in terms of obstruction as well. I think I was referring to trying not to lay hose in the middle of stairwells, try and tuck it against the wall, particularly the inner wall. So if we do have residents or firefighters exiting and entering that staircase, there's less of a trip hazard for them. That's a good practice. But depending on the location of the dry riser outlets, we have to have a confirmed water supply. So we have to work with what we're given.
How feasible would it ever have been to plug or set a hose into a dry riser outlet on every floor or a lot of floors in Grenfell Tower and not use the dry riser from the floor below? How feasible would that ever have been?
Could you just repeat that for me?
Yes, how feasible would it ever have been to set into the dry rising outlets on every floor in Grenfell Tower or on every floor where there was a fire?
That's almost an impossible task. It's something it's not designed. The dry riser man is not designed to do that. The expectation is back to compartmentation. That it should, we'll only be really firefighting on one floor. Okay, it may go up. We can firefight in the internal to external 1 or 2 floors, but not to plug hose in on every single outlet on a high-rise block. No. It can be done, but it would be extremely difficult. And the further you go up the building, the water pressure would lessen. The output, going back, it only provides us 1,500 litres per water per minute. The more jets you put in, that's going to affect the water supply.
And I can't resist. I mean, what would happen after you got above 50 metres?
The water supply would almost be non-existent.
Non-existent?
I would say so, yes.
Mr. Dowden, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, this is now a convenient moment for a break. I'm going to turn to a
Yes,
topic.
we'll have a break now. I think perhaps on this occasion we'll take 15 minutes, and I'd like to be back by 25 to 12 by that clock. Not all the clocks are the same, so I'm going to go by that one. Right, Mr. Dowden, we'll have a break. I should have reminded you earlier, please don't discuss your evidence or this aspect of the inquiry's work while you're still giving evidence.
Yes.
All right, and we'll come back in 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, we'll get Mr. Dowden back. All right, Mr. Dowden, happy
Yes.
to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Phillips?
Mr. Dowden, can I ask you please to look at page 4 of your statement, and together let's look at paragraph 3, which starts, I contacted G331, and I want to look with you at the sentence that says at 1:13 hours. And you say, at 1:13 hours, I made the decision to further resource the incident by making it Pump 6 and Aerials 1. First question, what did you, when you did this statement, what did you base your timing on?
The timing was, I got the timings from our mobilisation system, Vision. I didn't have any understanding or recollection of the actual timing, so the only reference I had to that within my statement was from a later point when I referred back to our mobilising system.
Where were you physically when you made that decision?
From my recollection, I believe I was still on the outside the building, ground floor level, and on the east elevation.
What information was your decision to make Pump 6 based on?
I don't remember any significant event or anything that triggered it. It was more of a contingency plan, if I'm honest. Having been at other high-rise incidents, to have additional resource for BA and an aero appliance is a good practice.
Who were you with when you made that decision? Perhaps I should ask you a slightly different way. Were you with anybody when you made that decision?
From memory, I think the only person that I was around at that time was my driver, Firefighter Dowden, but I can't. That's not 100% accurate. But that's only what I can account now.
Yeah.
Do you remember speaking to anybody about the decision to make Pump 6 before you made it?
I don't have any recollection of that, no.
Now, Mr. O'Keefe has provided a witness statement, which we're going to be looking at with him. But to be fair to you, I should just tell you what he says, and that's that he went up to you when he arrived in front of the tower and asked if you'd made up the incident. And he said that you said no, and he said you should make it 6. Do you remember that?
I don't, no.
You don't. Now, in the next sentence in your witness statement, you say, at this point, it hadn't taken hold, and I felt comfortable with what we were dealing with, as the fire was still contained within the compartment, and there were no persons within the flat. When you say, at this point, it hadn't taken hold, could you explain, please, what you mean by that?
So from my point of view, as an incident commander, the resourcing level was okay. From my understanding, I was still dealing with a compartment fire within the tower block in flat 16. And from my understanding, my recollection, it was still contained within flat 16.
Could you see the exterior of flat 16 at that point?
believe I could, yes.
What could you see? You remember?
It's difficult. There was a lot of information. I wouldn't specifically be able to give you in terms of what my actual visual was on at that moment in time. No, it's difficult.
Now, Mr. Dowden, this, as you might imagine, is not a memory test for you. So I'm going to show you some video evidence which might help your recollection, and we can look at it together, and then you can help me with some questions I've got. Before I show it to you, I do have to make a warning for people in the room and for who are watching live stream, and we call that a trigger warning. So I'm going to repeat the trigger warning in relation to the Luke Bisbee fire spread video. We are about to look at that video again, not the whole of it, just a small portion of it, but it does show fire on the exterior of Grenfell Tower. And so anybody who feels uncomfortable about that should take steps to leave the room now or protect themselves. So, Mr. Dowden, would you forgive me if I wait a minute to allow people to do that? And in the meantime, can I ask Mr. Trial Director to queue up the Bisbee fire spread video at 1:12:04, 1:12:04, or perhaps as close to 1:12 as you can accurately get. I'll just wait another 30 seconds, if I may, Mr. Chairman, just to make sure that the trigger warning has been understood.
Yes, and also we have to remember there are people watching in the other locations
Exactly.
who might be leaving. Yeah.
That's right. Now, before we start looking at the video, Mr. Dowden, on the screen there we've got a still effectively taken from the video, and this was taken by a member of the public, in fact it's Mr. Kabede, I think at this point, and this shows I think the east side of the tower, and you can see the fire there at that point. Can you, just on this still, identify who the firefighters are on the ground in the foreground there? And this is at 01:12:04.
I can only presume that the firefighter on the jet, what we call a covering jet, was firefighter Murphy, but I can't 100% be accurate on that.
What about the other firefighter?
It could be firefighter Charlie Cornelius, who was part of the crew from Golf 331 Kensington. Again, I cannot confirm that.
And on the ground there, and this is a point I had for later, but we can pick it up now. On the ground there, in front of the east side of the tower, you can see what looks like a liquid, water, perhaps. Can you help with what that might be?
I can only presume that is water from the covering jet.
When one sets into a hydrant or sets into a pump with a covering jet, is it normal to give a test first? Say you do a spray before you apply the jet to the exterior of a building?
It's correct, because obviously there'll be air in the hose line, so we have to obviously drain that out and make a sound. And once we get water at the end point of the branch, but also to test the branch to make sure it's working, go through a sort of set of test procedures, flow rates, and different settings to make sure the branch is operable. Yes, right. That is something that's not is a usual practice. That's correct.
Looking at the quantity of water that you can see on the ground there, would that be consistent with such a test?
It's difficult to say. It depends how long that test was for. It's either one or two things. It's either from the covering jet was working, or it was from a test. I wouldn't be able to confirm either.
Very good. I'm now going to ask for that the video be played, but not the entirety of it, and I'll give a signal when I want it to stop. Stop. Now, that's the video, and you'll have heard that there's an audio in the background. What I'm going to do is ask for that to be played again, but if you could listen out for the audio and the voices that you hear, which if they could be made louder would be better. I'm going to ask you some questions about who's saying what. So Mr. Trial Director, could we play that again, please? And you can stop. Could you hear someone shouting?
I could hear something, yeah.
Now, people may disagree about this. To us, it sounds like Mike, make it 6 now. Can you comment on that?
From that audio, I could not tell that was what was said, no.
Does this prompt any recollection about someone shouting to you to make pump 6?
I can't recall that, no.
All right. Can we run the video again? And before we do, I just want to ask you to look out for what you can see in terms of the fire and the material coming from the fire. Could we play that again, please? Could you see material falling from the window where the fire was?
Could you play that again for me, please? Just to...
Could we play it again, please? And go on a little bit further, you can see a bit more. Could you see?
The source, maybe an ember or something hit the floor. Yeah.
Yes. Do you remember at that point? Well, let me ask you. Do you remember that point in the development of the fire, at around 1:12, when embers started to come out of the window?
I can't be time specific. There was a point in my statement where I said I started to feel uncomfortable because I'd seen something that the fire was behaving, or I'd not seen how it was behaving before in terms of the way it was reacting. And, I referred to my statement, it was like magnesium was burning, it was almost like sparking and spitting, and that's not generally something I've seen on an external building before.
We're going to come back to that in some detail later on, but at this point, can I just ask you, at this point in the fire, when pumps were being made 6, had anything changed so that you now thought you needed to make pump 6 as opposed to leaving them at the original 4?
My recollection of the event and at that time was that when at the point of I made it pump 6, I was still quite comfortable. It was more of a contingency thing. That was my point. That's how I remember it on that night.
And what about the addition of an aerial ladder? Had anything changed in the development of the fire to prompt you to ask for an aerial ladder?
Not from my recollection at that point, no.
Now, at that point, 1:12 or 1:13, either way, the point at which pumps were made 6 plus an aerial ladder, given that you were preparing to fight a high-rise fire at a height up to the height that could be reached by an aerial ladder, did you have any thoughts about whether the stay-put policy in place at Grenfell Tower remained appropriate?
At that point of that VT?
Yes.
I wouldn't, as an instant commander at that moment in time, feel that I'd need to change that, no.
Right. Were you, at the point at which you made pump 6, were you concerned about what you had in front of you?
From my recollection, referring to my statement, not at that point, no. Now,
in the light of what we've seen in the video, which is material falling down to the ground. Can I just take you to your statement? And you say, I think I've shown you, in the 7th line down in the 3rd paragraph on page 4, at that point it hadn't taken hold. Sorry, at this point it hadn't taken hold, and I felt comfortable with what we were dealing with as the fire was still contained within the compartment. In light of what I've now shown you and what you call embers falling down to the ground, can you just explain why you say in your statement that the fire hadn't taken hold and that it was still contained in the compartment?
I was reacting to what I thought was happening at that moment in time, with everything that went on that incident and everything that I had to deal with, everything I saw, decisions I made, the sensory overload. My recollection at the time of that statement was that was my feeling.
Understand. At that point, had you had any information from any residents regarding the state of the fire or the smoke within the building?
From my recollection, not at that point, no.
At that point, and just to be clear, we're talking about the point at which you made pump 6, did you make any assessment regarding the number and frequency of any residents leaving Grenfell Tower?
That's not something I can recall.
Let me ask a slightly simpler question. Do you remember at that point seeing any residents or occupants leaving Grenfell Tower?
Not that there may have been, but I can't remember taking no.
Right. Now, according to Mr. O'Keefe's contemporaneous notes, he had been told, and we'll explore this with him, he had been told by firefighters Stern and Hipple that there was heavy smoke logging on the 6th floor and that he, O'Keefe, reported that to you and advised you to make pumps 6. That's what he's recorded in his contemporaneous notes. Can you comment on that?
I don't have any recollection of that, no.
Do you say that he's wrong, or do you say that he's right? You just can't remember?
Absolutely not. But
right.
That may have been the case, that may have been his understanding, but I don't have any recollection of that event, no.
Can you explain the process whereby you made pump 6?
From my understanding, it would have been, I believe that I would have asked my driver, Firefighting Dan Bills, to send that message.
Do you know what appliance the message was sent from? Do you remember?
Not at that moment in time, no.
Can I ask you, please, to look, I think, at a document for the first time in your evidence, which is tab 23 of the bundle, which is the short incident log disclosed to us by the London Fire Brigade, which is MET 000-13830. And this is, just so you, to be fair to you, you know what it is. There's a short version of a much longer document which identifies a number of messages in chronological order through the incident. And if you go, please, to page 17, you can see that a quarter of the way down, underneath or next to the time stamp of 1:13:39, SAD makeup IUP G331 make pump 6 and 1 HP, and then that was amended a minute or so later 40 seconds or so later, to amended to one aerial. What I wanted to ask you about was looking at the entry on this document, which we call the short incident log, or the SIL. Can you explain the message IUP G331, make pump 6 and 1 HP?
So that denotes that the initial make pump 6 and the request for an aerial was sent via Golf 331, which was Kensington's pump ladder.
Yeah. And do you know why that would be?
Like I said, obviously they were in attendance at the time, and whether obviously my perception of where that message went is incorrect, and it went from Golf 331.
Right. Why would it go from G331 and not from the ICP? Do you know?
Because my explanation for that would be that obviously that dynamic stage of the incident, resourcing levels, personnel at a minimum, and that was facilitated maybe by the driver of Golf 331.
Right. And do you remember what type of aerial was requested? There's an amendment from 1 HP, which I think is this right, high platform?
Hydraulic platform, yeah.
Yes, hydraulic platform, quite right. And amended to 1 aerial. Do you remember what aerial you asked for?
I don't think there's any specifics, whether it was a TL or an ALP, aerial ladder platform.
No. Okay, we may explore that with other people. You can put that away. Is it normal procedure for a watch manager to be in charge at a fire of more than 4 pumps?
As policy states, no. A watch manager B should be up to 4 pumping appliances with a monitoring officer of a station manager rank. Once it goes beyond that to 6 pumping appliances, the monitoring officer with the rank of station manager will effectively take over. Yes. However, you have a little bit of degree of flexibility in that, because obviously officers get into the incident ground, depending how quick the makeup is. There may be a little bit of overhang in terms of how long, as a watch manager, you're in charge of an incident.
Right. And is it right that according to LFB policy, a 6-pump fire requires 2 station managers and a group manager as monitoring officer?
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, in your statement, if you go back to it, you say G362 arrived. This is just a sentence on from where we were before. G362 arrived and I directed the crew to go to the bridgehead with their breathing apparatus. And then you say, I also requested that G331 get a covering jet to the outside of the flat where the fire was, in order to keep it contained and stop it spreading above and below the compartment. I just want to ask you a question or two about that. At this point in time, did you have any thoughts about whether the fire was still within the compartment or whether it had broken out of the compartment? When I say at this point, let me be clear, at the point at which you asked G331 to put a covering jet on the outside.
It's difficult to pinpoint the exact time, but yes, the fire did break out the compartment in terms of the window, but that's not an uncommon thing in compartment or building fires. And the way we counteract that is to suppress that fire spread is with external covering jet. We don't want to be putting into compartments, particularly if firefighters are working, because that really can decrease the conditions and risk of firefighters in the compartment, but certainly above and below, to stop any upward and downward fire spread.
So let me just see if I can ask the question again a slightly different way. At the point in time at which you asked G331 to put a covering jet on the outside of the flat where the fire was, at that point in time, did you have any thoughts about whether the fire was still contained within the compartment or had broken out?
no direct thoughts come to my mind, but it lends itself to that, okay, it had come out of the compartment, because that's the job of a covering jet, is to protect, to stop the spread of a compartment fire that's potentially breached the window, yes.
So, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do I understand it this way, that you had asked for the covering jet to be put on the exterior because you saw there was a real risk of the fire breaching out of the compartment window? Is that fair? Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. Now, again, you won't have seen this, but I want to ask you about it. Crew Manager Secret says in a statement that he's given us that he recalls that at the point when the first BA crew, which is Charlie Batterby and Daniel Brown, were at the door of flat 16, you radioed Crew Manager Secret and told him that the fire was breaking out of the window. That's what he remembers.
Right.
Do you remember that? Do you remember having that conversation?
I remember having there was traffic between me and Chris, because I knew we had a BA crew up on the bridge, going up to the fire floor. And at the point where I started to feel uncomfortable, I think that's when I sent some traffic into Chris on the bridgehead and asked him, have we got a team within the compartment? Are they putting water on the fire? Because from what I could see on the outside, it was developing. I didn't know at that point that any face or exterior of the building was involved. I just thought there was a developing compartment fire that had, from the window, breached the window and coming out the window.
Right. Can I just explore what you've just said, which is that you just thought there was a developing fire coming, or a developing compartment fire that had come out from the window. So when a fire comes out of, in your experience, when it comes out of a compartment window in a high-rise block, I think you've said before that that's not uncommon, but would that, to you, mean a breach of compartmentation?
Not specifically, because that's on the external. For me, the compartmentation is the internal part, an internal part of the building. So, for me, as an incident commander on the outside, I wouldn't be too concerned if a fire had breached the window, because I would be. My assumption was that we could tactically control that from the ground, particularly at the full floor level with a covering jet.
So, the exit of flames from the window, would that be a game changer in terms of your strategy, or not?
Not at that point. The only change of strategy which we had in place was to implement a covering jet.
Now let's just go to the question of the covering jet. Mr. Secret, Crew Manager Secret, says in his statement that you told him that you wanted to put a covering jet on the exterior. Do you remember it that way?
Not to those exact words. The purpose of a covering jet is to stop the external fire spread, but also to cool any gases that are exiting from the building as well. My recollection was that I was hoping that we could not put it into compartment, but put it above and beyond the compartment to stop any external fire spread that potentially could occur.
And he says in his statement that he, Crew Manager Secret, told you not to put a covering jet on because the BA crew was just about to make entry into the flat. Do you remember it that way?
I don't remember that. Don't remember those specifics, no. The only thing I really quite remember about the covering jet is that, particularly, and I've had this confirmed by Des Murphy, who's a firefighter who was at Kensington at the time, he's now on my watch, at North Kensington Red Watch. My instruction was don't put it in a compartment, just put it above and beyond. Going back to if we put a covering jet into a compartment as firefighters, that's going to pose a serious risk and increase the risk of firefighters within the compartment because of, without going too much of science, the expansion rate of water to steam is 1700 to 1. So you are really, really going to put a real risk to firefighters within any compartment where we put water into it where they are.
Yes. And you say that in your statement. In the passage I think we've just highlighted, in fairness to you, it was necessary, you say in your statement, to aim water above and below the compartment. You see where it says that?
Yeah.
But not directly into it, as that could affect the firefighters working within the compartment. You see that? So that was your, well, first question, was that your thinking at the time?
Yes.
And was that the subject of a conversation that you had with Crew Manager Secret?
From my recollection, I beg your pardon, from my recollection, yes.
Now, Crew Manager Secret says in his statement, and I just want to put this to you so as to get your recollection, he says that he told you to put the jet above or below the window but not into it. He says he was the one who said that. Do you recall that?
Again, with everything that the initial officers did in that fireground that night, we gave a lot of directions, we gave a lot of orders, we had to make a lot of quick and dynamic decisions. Everyone's perception of what they did that night is going to be quite different from each, and I have to be true to my account, and Chris is going to be true to his account.
Yeah, that's very fair. Can I then look a little bit down the page, and you say, and this is also at the top of page 5, you say, I knew the crews were now tackling the fire within the compartment, but I noticed that the fire had now breached the window of the flat on the 4th floor and was starting to affect the external fascia of the building. Now, can you remember whether your discussion with Crew Manager Secret about the covering jet was before you first saw that the fire had breached the window of the flat, or after it?
I can't confirm that. That's difficult.
Right. Just to see if I can jog your recollection, Mr. Secret says that it was after you first saw that, and we'll explore with him how he knows that, but assuming he's right about that, what's your recollection?
I can't be time specific. I know that traffic was happened, but I really can't pinpoint in terms of when that happened or in relation to Chris's statement.
And again, Mr. Dowden, that's very fair. This is not a memory test. No. It's just that we have to go through some of these details. When you spoke to, or having spoken to Crew Manager Secret about the jet, did you give any instructions as to where the jet should be aimed?
As previously discussed, for me it was above and below the compartment of origin, but not to be put directly into the compartment. Right.
And who did you give those instructions to? Do you remember?
From my memory, it was firefighter Des Murphy, who was on the initial covering jet crew.
Anybody else?
There was another firefighter on the jet, and I believe it was firefighter Charlie Cornelius, but I can't confirm that.
Cornelius. Now I'm going to show you another clip of the Luke Bisbee video, and this time at 01:12:15, and then I'll let it run on, over into the next clip. And I'm not sure if I need, Mr. Chairman, to repeat the trigger warning every time we go to a clip.
Well, I think it would
It's
be
probably sensible.
because we don't know if someone's come in, not just to this room, but to one of the other rooms. So I think you better.
Yes, quite right. Mr. Dowden, would you bear with us while we just give the trigger warning again? And we're about to show another section of the Luke Bisbee fire spread video clip, which shows scenes of Grenfell Tower on fire on the night. And if anybody feels uncomfortable about viewing those, then they should take steps not to view them now. And we'll allow another 30 seconds to elapse, Mr. Chairman, if that's enough.
Yes, thank you.
While we're just waiting, Mr. Dowden, what I'm going to do, and this is the things to look out for, I'd like you to look out for two things in these sequences: the timing of the covering jet going on, and secondly, any burning material coming off the building. Those are the two things we're just trying to get a handle on. Mr. Child Director, if you could now play the loop starting at 01:12:15. Right, thank you. No, that's. We'll perhaps play the beginning of the next, if you will, as well. Stop there. Thank you very much. Now, excuse me, Mr. Dowden, I want to ask you a number of questions about the sequence we've just seen. And I'd ask you, first of all, to look at this and answer a question whether you see any covering jet on the building at the start of the sequence. If we can just play the first part of the sequence. And just look out for the timing as to when the jet goes on. At the moment, 15:39, we see no jet. Is that right? Just pause there. So far, 15:47, we see no jet on the outside of the window. And yet we see this burning material coming off. Does that accord with your recollection?
It's difficult to say. I didn't have a timeline at that time running, but if I'm honest, I thought the covering jet was up and working before that point, from my recollection at that moment in time.
That's very fair. Can we just move?
Before we move on, can I just ask, in the centre of those three pictures there, it might be the case that there's someone wearing a white helmet, and if that is the case, do you think that might be you?
That would be me. Yeah.
You think it is you?
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. So did you have a good view of the covering jet going onto the window and the material coming off the window?
As it stands in those images, then yes.
And then if we go on just a little bit further with the clip, we'll see the covering jet being applied. And there it goes on. Now, my question, and we'll come to the next clip shortly, but my question is whether, and I think you've answered this, but I just want to get it absolutely clear, having shown you the whole of the clip, whether that was the first time that the jet goes onto the exterior, or whether there's an earlier point in the development of the fire before burning material comes down from the window that the jet was being applied.
I can't recall two separate times that the jet was working. My recollection was that I was concerned with the development of fire on the outside. Had traffic with crew manager Chris Secret, wanted to get a covering jet up, but not into compartment. The plan was to make it sure that we could get it above and below, and that's the instruction I gave to the covering jet crew. Now, can't be time specific, but that's my recollection of that event at that time.
Now, I'm going to ask for the clip to be played once more. The question I've got for you is, as we look at it, whether the jet was being applied below the compartment or above the compartment. So from that clip, where do you think? Does that prompt a recollection as to where the jet was being aimed?
In that image there, it looks like it's difficult because of the development of the fire. It looks like it's pointing at the base of where the fire is.
Right. At the base?
That it does look there, yes. But my recollection was that my instruction was above and below the compartment, but from that image there, it looks like it's at the base.
After the sequence we've just seen, do you remember whether you stayed there to continue to monitor what the firefighters aiming the jet on the exterior were doing, or did you move away and go and do another task?
Again, I wouldn't be able to be time specific. I was quite mobile, particularly on that ground floor area. I didn't stay in one position. I wasn't static. I was very mobile, pacing to, yeah. Without this, if there's any images or video that otherwise, I was quite mobile and walking around, so I don't think I was static in one position for a long period of time.
No. Now, we're going to come back to the next sequence in just a moment. So the same trigger warning will continue to apply throughout the next 5 or 10 minutes or so, Mr. Chairman. That's all right. Can I just ask you this? Can you please look at page 4 of your statement, back to page 4. And it's a sentence we've already looked at. 7 lines up from the bottom of page 4. After the sentence, it was necessary to aim water above and below the compartment, etc. And then you say, at this point the fire was still in the compartment, but the window had failed in that it had broken. You see that? I just want to ask you about that. This is at the point when the exterior jet is being applied. In the video, we saw that there was burning material coming off the window at the moment when the jet was being applied. Now, if that was the first time that the exterior jet was being applied, is it right that the fire was still within the compartment?
Sorry, could you repeat that question, please?
Yes. Having seen the video and the burning material coming off the building at the moment when the exterior jet was applied, is it right to say that at that point the fire was still in the compartment?
Looking at the images we've seen, then it looks like the fire has exited out of the compartment, but at that moment in time when I made that statement, that was my recollection of events.
I understand. By this point in time, when we see the covering jet going on and the burning material coming off, about 1:15, did you consider the risk of failure of compartmentation around flat 16? And when I say around, I mean anywhere in relation to flat 16.
The only reference I have to that the external, in terms of the window that had failed and obviously the fire was developing outside that compartment on the external of the building.
What did you make? Sorry, start again. Do you remember seeing the burning material coming off the building at about that point?
I remember seeing, and this is the point where I started to feel uncomfortable in terms of how the fire was reacting and behaving on the external, as I referred to in my statement. It was sparking and spitting and reacting like a magnesium burn. So that's the only real reference that I can say that when I saw that, maybe that was my reference in terms of stuff or debris falling from the building.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. But at the moment when you saw the material coming off the building like that, did you assess the risk of breach of compartmentation?
The only reference I can make to that is just, I don't remember having a conscious decision on that, but because I had the covering jet out, for me that was a control measure to try and negate any fire spread on the external of that building.
Now we're going to come back to what happens next in terms of fire spread in a moment, and you're feeling uncomfortable, so I want to ask you about that. But before we do, can I just ask Mr. Trial Director to roll the film on again? I just want to ask one or two questions about the exterior jet. Again, so if you start at 16, I want you to follow this through, please. Watch the exterior jet and then listen out also for the audio. And just to say, the trigger warning I gave 5 minutes ago still remains in place.
Yeah.
We've paused there, just pausing there. What can you see from that video about where the jet is being aimed?
It's being aimed at from that VT at the base of where the fire is.
The base, and not above?
No.
Can you continue, please?
People on the block, bro. It's not high enough.
Right. Now, in that clip, we can see, perhaps just play it again, because it looks as if you can see the hose stream being applied below the window and a voice saying it's not high enough. Can you just play that again, please?
People on the block, bro. It's not high enough.
Right. Just pause there. We heard the voice saying it's not high enough, and you can see the hose stream being applied below the window. Can you comment on the voice that says it's not high enough? What was your, if you had seen that, well, first of all, did you see that at the time? Did you see the hose stream being applied below the window as opposed to above the window?
It's not something I have a clear memory of at that moment in time on that instant ground. I didn't hear the visual, that audio visual, that it's not high enough, it's not high enough.
Yeah. I mean, assuming it's a member of the public saying it's not high enough, can you comment on that? Let me ask the question, what would a member of the public know about where to aim an exterior jet and then say it's not high enough?
So the member of the public's only reacting to what they've seen in front of them. But again, in that moment of that incident, with the resources we had, we will try and do what we can to with the resources we had that jet, and at that point in time, it didn't look like it was effective.
Did you go back and take steps to ensure that the covering jet was aimed above the window?
I can't recall that, no.
Mr. Chairman, I think now may be an appropriate moment for a 5-minute
We'll have
break.
a break in just a second. I'd like to ask one question, or perhaps more than one. I assume there's a maximum height to which a covering jet like that can reach. Do you happen to know what it is?
I would say the maximum you'd be looking at, depending on what water pressure you can get, is probably a maximum of. That's probably about its maximum, about 4 floors, if I'm honest.
What?
4. It may be more. I mean, I couldn't give you an exact in terms of height.
Well, no, but I just wondered whether, in your own opinion, it would be possible for a covering jet to be playing on the floor above the floor where the fire was. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I just wondered what you would say about that.
At the time that the fire, I ordered the covering jet the covering jet was working. I was confident that the resource we had there would be sufficient to try and suppress that fire. In a normal compartment fire, in a high-rise building known it to be constructed.
So you think there was a fair chance that you could have got water onto the level above where the flat on fire was? At that moment in time, that would be my thinking. Yeah. Right, thank you. Should we have a short break then, please? Let's say resume at 25 to 1. All right, would you like to lead us? Now, Mr. Dowden, I understand that you would welcome a break at this point. And Mr. Millett, I was going to suggest that we might rise for an early lunch now, but resume at 1:45 instead of 2 o'clock, thereby giving a slightly longer break for lunch without losing too much time. Would that inconvenience you? Well then, Mr. Dowden, we'll do that. We'll have a slightly longer lunch break, but we'll take it now and resume at 1:45.
Thank you.
You're all right to do that?
Yeah.
And please remember not to talk about your evidence during the break.
Thank you. Cheers.
All right? Thank you very much. Okay.